All right. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do have a good amount of information to share with you this morning, so I want to allow time to do that, as well as allow plenty of time for your questions at the end. But before I jump into our content today, I do want to just acknowledge that it's been, I think, the past, not only the past few months, but in particular the past week or so, it's been a very emotional and soul-searching, painful time for individuals and for our country as a whole. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the pain many of us are feeling, and offer my support and the support of UC Davis in all that we're going through at this moment in time. And given all that's happening in the world, and with that, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today, and taking a moment out of your everything else that's going on in the world to join us on this webinar. So thank you so much, and we appreciate you being here, and we're hopeful that things will improve in our country and in our community. So again, on behalf of UC Davis Continuing and Professional Education, I welcome you. UC Davis Continuing and Professional Education is the workforce development arm of the university, providing a wide range of wonderful certificates and training for the community, and very highly regarded and academically challenging and sound programs. So they are the sponsor of this series of webinars. So today we're going to be talking about acing your virtual interview. And certainly interviewing itself is a challenging endeavor. And then when you add on top of that, trying to do that virtually and figuring that out, that whole new realm, it can be very overwhelming. And one benefit maybe of the pandemic is that we've all gotten a little more familiar with these online formats. We've been forced to, and I know when I did my first webinar back in early April, I really felt very nervous and uncomfortable with the format. But now, a few months down the road, I'm feeling more comfortable, and yet at the same point know that there's a lot more to learn. So I'm going to give you some tips today on how to really perform well in these virtual interviews, as well as interviewing in general. So some of this information will be valuable to you even once we return to whatever normal will look like in the future for interviews. So what I'm hoping today to do is to build your confidence. And one thing I want you to think about in terms of interviewing is to try to shift your mindset from thinking about an interview as going in and having to brag about yourself or sell yourself, to really thinking about that experience as going in and sharing information. The interviewers, the company that's looking to make a hire, they want to hire someone, they need to hire someone. And yet at the same point, they need information so they can make an informed decision. So you don't necessarily have to think about going in and using lots of flowery adjectives to describe how wonderful and fantastic you are. Really, it's just about sharing information. It's about sharing facts about what your experience and skill set is that is relevant to the job that you're applying for. So sometimes just kind of working into that mindset can relieve a little bit of the anxiety that you may be feeling. At the same time, you don't want to leave the whole process to chance. And so preparation and practice are your keys to success. I often hear from clients and others that they are extremely nervous in interviews. It ranks right up there with public speaking. But oftentimes at the same point, they just kind of go into it hoping for the best, without really doing the things that might help them reduce some of that anxiety and feel a little bit more prepared. So hopefully these tips I'm going to give you today are going to allow you to have that confidence You'll probably always still be a little bit nervous. I think in my 20 years of doing career counseling, I can count on one hand the number of people who have told me that they just love interviewing. For most of us, it's not one of our favorite things to do. So what can you do to prepare? So first of all, I want you to make sure that when you're preparing for an interview, whether it be virtual or in person, whether it be by phone or video, that you research the position and the organization. You want your answers to be relevant to the position. You want them to be on point. And it's hard to do that if you're unclear about what the position is, or you're unclear about the organization that you're applying to, what their services are, what their values are, what they're all about. So how can you go about doing this research? First of all, you want to analyze the job description. Go through that job description, really pull out all the different skills they're talking about, all the different requirements. And oftentimes when we're going through a job description, we're looking through it and we're saying, check, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. And so what you want to do with all those things that you say you can do is to think about what's your proof point? What's your example that you would use, a specific example that shows that you've had that experience or that you have that skill? So use that job description as a guide for preparing. Now, you're not going to have perfect information, but you can gather quite a bit from usually that job description. You want to do the same thing with gathering information about the organization. So certainly you want to thoroughly review their website, all the different aspects of it. You might want to look up the organization on some of their social media to see what they're putting out. Perhaps they're on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter. What are they talking about? What types of values are they sharing? How do your experiences and values align with that? Those are things that you might bring out in the interview. You might also on LinkedIn look to see if you have any connections to that organization. Maybe you reach out to them and let them know that you're having an interview, and might they offer any insights into the organization? Where is it headed? What are the skills that are most valued there? So really dig deep and see what kind of information you can find out. You also, when you're preparing for the interview, you want to eliminate any unknowns. So when you're contacted to have the interview and to get that scheduled, you want to ask some simple questions. How long will the interview be? Who will be on the interview or in the interview room? Or who will be on the call? Who will be in the Zoom interview with you? It can be very unsettling when you have an interview scheduled and you sign into that Zoom meeting and all of a sudden you see that there's 8 people staring back at you when you thought maybe it was only going to be one. That can send your nerves right through the roof and have you not performing very well. So eliminate some of those unknowns so that, of course, you won't know exactly what questions they're going to ask you, but some of those other unknowns you won't have to be worrying about. You also want to gather some materials to have around you during the interview. Not that you want to be looking down at your notes too much or filing or leafing through papers to find out that great answer you wrote to the question that they've just asked you. But I would recommend that you maybe print out or have available to you the resume that you submitted for the position, your cover letter, an application if there was one, any kinds of maybe a few notes of what you are going to want to communicate during the interview. Hopefully you'll have a few questions to ask them that you've already prepared. So having those materials around you can be very helpful. You may end up not even having to look at them because you're so well prepared, but just knowing that they're there can serve as sort of a security blanket so that if your mind completely goes blank, that you've got something to refer back to. The other thing that you can do prepare is to set your agenda. Now that may seem a little strange sounding to you because you're thinking, well, what do you mean my agenda? The interviewers, they're going to determine what questions to ask. And that is certainly true. But at the same point, after doing your research and looking at the job description, understanding what the organization is about, analyzing how your background and experience fits with that, then you're going to want to have some idea about what it is that you want to communicate during that interview. When you get off that call or get off that Zoom meeting, what is it that you want to make sure that they know about you? And so whether they ask you a specific question about those things or not, you can weave those themes into your answers. Or at the end of the interview, when typically they'll ask if you have anything to add or any questions for them, if there's some big piece of your background and experience that you think is important and relevant to the position that you haven't had a chance to share, then that would be your time to share it. So think about what you want to communicate. What do you want to make sure that they know about you? You don't want to get off that call or leave that Zoom meeting and say, gosh, I never got to tell them this. They never even asked about that. It's imperative that you are prepared to bring that up if you think it's really important. So those are some things you can start to do to prepare. In addition, of course, when we talk about virtual interviews, it's really important to set the stage. And probably some of you are getting better at this if you've been on a number of Zoom meetings, but I want to mention some specific things that you want to do so that you'll make the best impression. So in terms of setting the stage, you want to have a clean and simple background. You don't want to have a bunch of stuff in the picture that's going to be a distraction. It's similar to what you might choose to wear, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but you want the focus to be on your words, and you don't want the focus to be on someone trying to peer in and see all the little things you have on your shelf or what the titles of the books are that you have in the background. You want them to be focused on you and what you're saying. So a clean, simple background with few distractions are best. You might, if you're, depending on the setting you're in, if you're in a household with other people or with children, put a note on the door that says, please do not disturb. I know sometimes it's challenging if you've got kids at home and no one to watch them, but this might be the one time you put them in front of their favorite video for a bit, or make some kind of bargain with them about, being quiet for a period of time. But try to eliminate those distractions. Maybe put a note on your front door about ringing the doorbell or knocking. With all the deliveries many of us are getting these days, you don't want that loud bang, bang, bang from the Amazon delivery guy going on in the middle of your interview. Also, think about the lighting. Ideally, you'll be able to have lighting that is facing towards you. If you have the light coming from behind you, then that puts your face in a shadow, which makes it difficult to see you, and especially to see your facial expressions, which are going to be really important in the interview because there's not going to be a lot of those other social cues. So you're going to want to make sure that people can see your facial expression. So try to have that lighting facing directly towards you. You might practice a little bit, set up a Zoom meeting with someone else, or if you don't have that capability, even FaceTime, and set that up and try some different setups, try some different lighting with someone else so that they can give you some feedback on whether or not they can see you. The other thing I want to mention is you want to make sure that the camera is looking at you in a head and shoulders sort of a view, and it's looking at you straight on. And I'll show you for a minute here what most people do with their with our laptops is we push it back a little bit, but you can see that's not a very attractive view. It's cutting me off. You don't want to have any ceiling in the picture, and it's not a good view of you. And it also communicates something about your ability to communicate in this new world that we have. And so getting your screen a little more straight up and down, you can see that feels a little bit more of a natural position to be talking to someone. You also want to test your technology. So this is one of the things you can do when they call for the interview is make sure that you know what platform they're going to be using to interview you. Is it Zoom? Is it WebEx? Is it some other platform that you're unfamiliar with? And if you are unfamiliar with that, be sure that you have it downloaded far in advance of when your interview is. practice with it if you can, watch some YouTube videos about how best to use it so that you're not messing with the technology and trying to figure that out actually during the interview. Make sure that you have a professional username. When, you know, as you can see, like on a Zoom call, your name's going to show up there, and you can change your name. So if you don't, you know, if you entered it way back when and you just put, you know, your initials or something like that, you might want to go in and rename yourself so that you've got a good professional name there under your picture. I just want to make sure that I've covered all the different things. Yes, be sure to check your microphone beforehand as well and make sure that that is all working. And I will give you a heads up that if you've been using your computer to show things like through your television or through your stereo system or something like that, then sometimes when you go back into Zoom, you need to play with the audio settings a little bit. So make sure if you're kind of switching back and forth between some of those mediums, that when you're ready for your interview, that it's all good to go for working with that format. Just checking that I've covered everything in that area. So let's talk a little bit about dress. So of course, in an interview, when you go into an interview, you're going to dress professionally. Same thing with a virtual interview. And I would really recommend that you get fully dressed. Don't leave the bottom half to chance. You know, you never know when something goes wrong, you spill your coffee, you need to get up for whatever reason, and you don't want to feel like, uh-oh, I can't stand up because I've got my shorts on, or this isn't going to look professional, or you've still got your pajama bottoms on. So make sure that you're fully dressed. The other advantage of this is that it really can help build your confidence to actually feel like you're fully dressed for the interview and you're putting your most professional, your most professional image forward. You do want to wear something that is not too busy, you know, something that will, again, not detract from your face and from your words. So it's not the time to make a big fashion statement or wear big dangly shiny earrings, those kinds of things. So keep it simple. And blues are always really good on virtual calls. So if you look good in blue, you might lean towards something like that. I know it's also a challenge at this point in time as we get into the hotter weather that, you know, depending on what your air conditioning is like, if you have it, then, you know, and you're nervous during an interview, then wearing a coat, a jacket, a tie, those kind of things during an interview, you can really get overheated. So what you might do is start out, say, with the coat on, and then if you get warm, it's completely fine to say, gosh, if you don't mind, it's warm, I'm gonna take my coat off. You know, we're in the middle of the Sacramento area summer. It's often days close to 100 degrees, so I don't think anyone's going to mind if you want to take your coat off. But do dress fully. The other thing I want to mention in regards to this area of setting the stage is the virtual background. So I mentioned to have a clean, non-distracting background, but you can also do a virtual background. The only thing I would say with that is be sure to practice with it. If some of you have used the virtual background in other meetings before, you know that depending on exactly where you're placed, that you can kind of go in and out of that background. So you want to make sure that if you are using a background that you stay in front of it so that you don't fade back into it and now they can only see half your face or those kind of things. So, but virtual backgrounds can be a great way to go because then you don't have to worry about how clean your background is, or gosh, the only good place you get internet is, you know, in the middle of your kitchen, and you don't want that to be your background for your interview, things like that. So play around with those virtual backgrounds, and that can be a good solution. Be sure to do a trial run with all of this. You can do that with a friend, you can do it with a family member, or a colleague, and make sure that you're comfortable with everything, that everything looks good, and that will help you feel a little bit more at ease when you log into the interview. Also, if you do wear makeup, you might think about wearing it a little bit heavier when you're on camera. So that's something that all broadcast people know. So it doesn't show up quite as much when you're on camera. So again, that's something that you can kind of test out a little bit. You might not want to put on so much that you look like a clown, but if you want to get the look that you want for your interview, then you might put it on a little bit heavier than usual. Make sure to clean your glasses so that you don't have smudges there. You know, everything you want to put out a real professional image. And I should say, you know, if you have questions, then we are going to have a lot of time at the end, both for general questions about interviewing, and also I'm going to give you the chance to write out some of the interview questions that you find most challenging, and we'll talk a little bit about how to best address some of those. So one more slide here on preparation. And you might be saying, okay, enough already with the preparation. Let's get to the interview itself. But preparation is so key to success in your interview. So even though your interview might only be 30 minutes or 45 minutes, the amount of time that you spend preparing should be triple that. So that's why I'm spending so much time on preparation, because indeed it is so important to the success. So more to do on preparation. Once you've got your stage set, you've got your outfit picked out, you've done some practice to know that all of that is working and everything's looking good. Then of course you want to anticipate questions. Go through that job announcement, think about questions that they might ask you that relate to the skills and experience that are there. In addition, you want to think about commonly asked interview questions. And there are lots of resources out there that will list commonly asked interview questions. You can find those on LinkedIn. They have a great interview preparation section. You can find those on Glassdoor. You can even on glassdoor.com look at questions that have been asked at a particular company that you're interviewing with. So you want to anticipate what kind of questions they might ask you and prepare your answers for those. And prepare not only just how much experience you have and where you've done that, but to prepare success stories that show specific examples of when you've done that, when you've utilized that skill. And actually, this is a little promo for next week's webinar, which is going to be specifically focused on preparing those success stories. So how can you take your accomplishments and put those into success stories that you can use not only in interviews, but on your resume and in other aspects of your career development. But you want to prepare those success stories. You also want to practice out loud. So it's one thing to sit down and anticipate questions and write down how you might answer those, but you really want to practice out loud. How we speak is a little bit different than how we write, or certainly how we think. And we may think, gosh, if they ask me about how to process payroll, gosh, I do that every month, or I do it every 2 weeks. I know that, like, you know, with my eyes closed, I know how to do that. But then when you get in an interview and they say, tell us about the process that you use to manage payroll, you kind of go blank. Or you start talking about this and then you say, but then I do that. And then you're like, wait, where was I heading with that? And it comes out all jumbled, or you find yourself rambling on. So by practicing out loud, you can take all your experience and get it into a nice, concise format that is logical and that hits on the key points that you want to communicate when you're in that interview. Now, when you're answering an interview question, if you're talking for more than about 2 minutes, you're probably rambling on too long. you can actually say quite a bit in 2 minutes. So that's the other advantage of practicing out loud, is that you can time yourself. And if you find that your answer is 10 minutes long to a fairly straightforward question, then you know you've got to go back and streamline it a little bit. So, and you can practice out loud. Ideally, you would do a mock interview. You would have a friend or a colleague or a family member actually do a mock interview with you. And in terms of preparing for a virtual interview, maybe even do that over Zoom or do that over FaceTime. So you have that experience of seeing what it feels like. But practicing out loud, if you can't do it with somebody else, or if you're a little uncomfortable doing that initially, just practice in front of the mirror. Practice in front of your dog or your cat. Your dog actually would probably be better, because your dog will be excited that you're talking to it, and your cat might just walk in the other direction and say, "Why are you bothering me?" But have that chance to practice out loud. Back in the old days, which was like, what, 4 months ago, I used to tell people to practice out loud in their car during their commute, but probably not too many of us are commuting anymore. But eventually, maybe we'll be back to that, and that's a great time to practice out loud too. And again, do that mock interview. So I do see someone put a question in the question and answer box, and that's great. You can go ahead and put additional questions in there as I go through, and we will definitely get to those. So one other thing I want to mention about preparation before I move into a few other items is, you know, all this preparation is great and you definitely want to do it, but you don't want to be cramming for your interview the night before. You don't want to stay up all night and go into the interview exhausted with dark circles under your eyes and having had to drink, you know, 10 cups of coffee that morning to keep yourself awake for the interview. That is not going to have you doing your best. So I would recommend, you know, do your preparation, and then the night before, spend some time relaxing, whatever it is that you might do that brings you that calm. Maybe it's some yoga, maybe it's a long walk, maybe it's watching a funny show, but give yourself that space to just kind of relax and breathe so that you can get a good night's sleep before your interview. And if anyone has any suggestions on what they do, something they do that's a healthy way to calm their nerves and relax before their interviews, then you know, please go ahead and share that with us. I think someone there at UC Davis Continuing and Professional Education can perhaps open up the chat box for a minute or so, and feel free to type your thoughts in there and suggestions to others on the call about what you do to relax before the interview. I know whenever I have a big thing coming up that I'm nervous about, a little yoga goes a long way with me, a little relaxing yoga. All right. So I know we're talking about virtual interviews here, and when we think about virtual interviews, we often think about the video interview. But I want to mention a couple other types of virtual interviews that are common and becoming more common. One is phone interviews, and everything that I've said at the moment, with the exception of setting the stage, applies to phone interviews. But one thing you might do is to print a photo of your interviewer, or even just of a smiling, friendly face, and put that in front of you while you're doing the interview. Oftentimes when we're doing a phone interview, we have a tendency to become a little monotone, and we're not getting any of those visual cues. And so it can be very challenging. But if you have a photo of the interviewer in front of you, that's going to encourage you to smile, to put out some of those facial expressions, which, while the other person can't see them, it is still communicated in your tone of voice. I know oftentimes people will say they'll stand in front of a mirror for their phone interview. Same kind of idea. At least they feel like they're talking to someone. You also might consider using headphones so as to cut back on any background noise. Again, you might stand up, both for a phone interview or a video interview, It builds your confidence and will keep you from again, slouching or leaning back, things that communicate a lack of interest. When you're on a phone interview, be sure to let the interviewer interrupt you. So if you're talking and you hear the interviewer start talking, then finish your sentence fairly quickly and let them go forward. Probably if they're starting to talk, they've heard enough and they're ready to move on. And again, in phone interviews, sometimes we particularly have a tendency to ramble because we have none of those social cues to pick up on that maybe they've heard enough, maybe it's time to move on. Also on the phone, you want to be sure to speak very clearly and often to slow down your speech a little bit. Because there's none of those visual cues, it can sometimes be hard to understand if you're not speaking clearly, slowly, and articulating what you're saying. And also, as I said, you know, because you don't have those visual cues, if you can provide them by, again, smiling even though they can't see you, and nodding, those kinds of things are going to help you feel more connected, and it will come across in your tone of voice. So those are just some quick tips for phone interviews. And then I want to talk about another type of virtual interview that is emerging. And we haven't seen a lot of this, but some companies are using this type of interview. And I think as we move forward, given the physical distancing, guidelines that are in force right now, that we may even see more of this. So what is an on-demand video interview? So the employer creates questions, and then they send a link with those questions out to a candidate, typically via an email. And then the candidate would click on that link, and through computer or phone, you would reply to those questions. Typically, you have 24/7 access to those questions, but they've given you a deadline for when you have to answer those. It's usually timed, so it may say you're going to have 30 seconds to answer each question, or you have up to a minute to answer each question. And oftentimes they will give you a practice run. So this can be very challenging because really you're just talking to yourself. You open up that link, it gives you the question. Sometimes it will give you that chance to practice your answer, and then it will say, now we're recording. And you push a button, you start answering, and it records your answer. And then when you're done answering all the questions they've put to you, then you submit that, and someone on the other side at the company reviews your video answers at a later time. So a few tips for this one. One, again, I think printing a photo of your interview or doing this in front of a mirror can be very helpful for all the same reasons I was mentioning in the phone interview. Standing, again, can be very helpful. You really want to, in those videos, show your enthusiasm and smile. They're not going to have much time to get a sense of your personality, so you really want to connect. And not that you want to be standing on a chair and cheering and all those kind of things, unless it's maybe for a mascot job, but you want to really communicate that you're engaged and that you're interested in this position. Like as in any virtual interview, you want to dress appropriately. You want to be clear and concise. And even though you may have a short amount of time, you want to bring in some specific examples so that they're going to remember your videos. So be on the lookout for that new emerging type of virtual interview. So there are always some unknowns with interviewing, and even though you prepare and you anticipate questions and you research the organization, there are always going to be some things that you don't know what to expect. So this is one of my favorite cartoons about interviewing. And this is what someone imagined that an IKEA job interview would look like. So the person comes in for the interview and the interviewer says, have a seat, but they've got to build their seat first. So seems like it would be very appropriate for an IKEA job interview, but I don't know about you, but I would definitely not pass it. Those things never turn out the way the picture looks on the front. All right. So now that you've done all this preparation, let's talk a little bit about what you should be doing during the interview. So during the interview, you want to make a great first impression, kind of a digital handshake, if you will. And how do you do that? So the first 5 seconds are typically very key. It's where someone's going to really, for better or worse, humans make those first impressions. That's just the way our minds work. We see something and we start trying to make sense of it. And so that usually begins to happen in the first 5 seconds. So right when you come on the call or the Zoom meeting, you want to be ready, prepared, leaning forward, smiling, and being engaged. That body language and nonverbal communication is really important in the video interview. You want to make eye contact. And that, of course, doesn't mean, I'm sure we're all getting a little bit used to this, and it feels a little strange. It doesn't mean looking over here so that I can see all the nice faces of people that are on the call. It means looking at that camera. So again, that's why it can be helpful to put a picture up there by the camera, so then you don't feel like you're just staring at a little green light or a little whatever color your light is, but that you're actually looking at someone during the interview, because that eye contact is really, really important. And you don't want to be like you're looking down or looking too far up. You can see, you can kind of get a sense of what that communicates as opposed to actually looking straight at someone. So make that digital handshake, make the eye contact. You want to speak clearly, as we've discussed before. You also want to be listening very, very carefully to what it is they're asking you. And if they're asking for an example, then be sure to provide one. After they ask a question, you might take a moment to pause, because as we all know with the video meetings, that sometimes you're talking over people and then they miss the beginning or end of what someone's been saying. So be sure you pause for a moment, and that will ensure that you're not talking over them and that you hear everything that they're saying. During the interview also, you want to share your accomplishments, your success stories, and I put a little asterisk next to that bullet point because, again, we're going to be talking about that next week in great detail. So hopefully you'll join us for that to learn a little bit about that. But that, by sharing those examples, by sharing those accomplishments, that is the key thing that's going to make you stand out in the interview, because you're going to be showing that you actually have the experience to do the things that they need you to do in that job. You also want to be sure that you ask questions. And even though this is a virtual interview, they typically will give you the opportunity to ask some questions at the end of the interview or to add anything. Again, we talked a little bit about some of the things you might add in terms of what your own agenda is. But if there's something else about your background and experience, you could add that. And you definitely want to have prepared maybe even as many as 6 or 7 questions. Not that you're probably going to ask 6 or 7 questions, particularly in a first interview, but you might ask 1 or 2, and oftentimes some of the questions that you have listed will have already been answered over the course of the interview, and so you want to have a good group of questions so that you've still got some to ask. And those should be questions that really show that you've done your homework. And then, of course, you want to close the deal. So at the end of the interview, you want to thank them for their time. You want to reiterate why you're interested in the position and let them know that you look forward to whatever the next steps in the process might be. And then, of course, after the interview, you want to follow up. You want to send a thank you email. You want to be timely with that. Not that you want to send it within 5 minutes of the interview being over, but if you interviewed in the morning, you might send that thank you email in the afternoon. or if you interviewed in the afternoon, certainly by the next morning, you'd want to get that email out. And you can send a group email. If you don't have the emails of everyone that interviewed you, then you might send a thank you email to the person who was coordinating and scheduling the interview, and first of all, thank them for all their help in setting things up, and then ask if they might be able to either provide you with the emails of the people that were involved in the interview, or if they would rather have you forward the thank you to them, and then they can forward it on to the others who were involved. But you always, always, always want to send a thank you email. It's amazing how many people don't send a thank you, and sometimes that can be the difference. People are monitoring that. Was this person, especially if the job involves any kind of customer service or outside contact with the public, they want to know that you have those skills, those good communication skills. So be sure to send that thank you email. Evaluate your performance. What went well? What didn't go well? What might you work on for the next time? How might you improve? Take each opportunity to learn and make improvements. And that's one of the great things about doing a mock interview, is that you're getting that opportunity to evaluate your performance and learn without it being during an actual interview. Also, I want to let you know it's totally okay to check in when appropriate after an interview. So if they say, we're going to be interviewing people this week, and then we hope to be back in touch with you by the middle of next week, and now it's Friday of next week and you haven't heard anything, it's completely fine to get back in touch with, again, whoever you've been in contact with at the organization, and say, hey, I just wanted to check in. I enjoyed the opportunity to interview last week, and I wanted to see where you are in the process. You don't want to say, I want to know if you're going to hire me, or I want to know if I'm going to get a second interview. You just want to very gently check in about their process and see if you can find out where things are. They may have had every intention to get back to folks by the middle of that week, but other things came up and things have gotten delayed a little bit. So just because you haven't heard doesn't mean that you didn't get the job. All right, so I know we've got about 15 minutes left, and what I'd really like to do during this time is to have you let me know in the question and answer box, what are some of the questions that challenge you the most during interviews? And then I'd be happy to answer those. Now, I'm not going to be able to answer maybe some job-specific questions that relate to your field, but I can certainly help you come up with thoughts on how to answer some of those commonly asked interview questions. And then also feel free to put in the question and answer box any questions you have about virtual interviewing in general, and I can try to answer those as well. So feel free to do that, and I'll answer some questions here for a while, and then I've got some slides at the end that I also want to share with you for some closing thoughts. So someone here in the question and answer box asks, let's say you feel you're a good fit for a job but are missing a skill or two the employer wants. If the interviewer asks you about one of your deficiencies, how should you respond? So that's a great question, because you read those job descriptions and oftentimes we have a lot of the things that are in there, but maybe sometimes we don't have this little thing over here or that little thing over here. So one, in preparing for the interview, you'll know what those things are that maybe you're lacking in a little bit. And so first of all, you can think about, is there anything that I've done that has transferable skills that relate to that? So you could speak to those. The other is to talk about how you're a quick learner and how you are eager to learn whatever that thing is that you don't have. Now, you can't just say, oh, but I'm a really quick learner, so I don't think I'd have any problem with learning that, even though I haven't had a lot of experience with it. You can start with that, but anyone could say they're a quick learner. You've got to give an example. So you might say, for example, when I started my position at Genentech, they were using this type of process in their laboratory. I hadn't had any experience in that, in using that process. So I did some reading outside of work. I watched some videos. I had a coworker walk me through the process. And by the end of the week, I was up and running with that process and was actually doing it better than 50% of the people who'd been there for the past 2 years. So don't just say that you could learn it or that you want to learn it. Give an example that shows in the past that you've been in a similar situation where you came into something and you didn't have the skill set to do it, but you quickly learned it. What did you do to learn it, and how did that turn out? So hopefully that answers your question. Somebody says, what's a good answer to tell me a little bit about yourself that is not on your resume? So this is a chance for you to maybe share something that is, you could go a little bit more in depth into a project that you did, maybe something that particularly relates to the work at the organization. Or it might be something that brings in a little bit of your personality. And this is where your research into the organization, the people you're interviewing with, can be valuable. So if you know that this organization is very committed to the environment, for example, then you might talk about, well, one thing that's not on my resume is that I'm in a hiking club and I really am committed to getting outdoors. So it could be something not personal, like I'm married and I have 3 kids, personal. Those are the things you don't want to share, but maybe something that shows a little bit about how your personality, your values might align with what the organization is doing. And it doesn't have to be a personal thing like that. It could be something that just is a skill set that maybe you think is an added advantage that it might be helpful for them to know. So somebody else asks, is it okay to ask about your remuneration in the interview? So I'm guessing you're asking about salary. When is it appropriate to start discussing salary? And really, it's not appropriate to start discussing salary, and I wouldn't suggest you start discussing salary until you actually have an offer in hand. That would be the time to discuss salary. Now, sometimes as you go through the interview process, they may be giving you some information about salary and benefits and things like that, so you can start to get those clues. And also, there's lots of research you can do through salary.com, through glassdoor.com. LinkedIn now has a tab under their jobs, I believe it's under their jobs section, that you can look up salary information. So you should be doing that research ahead of time to find out for that job title in that geographic area, what is kind of the range that you should be expecting. But again, talking about compensation wouldn't be something that happens until you have an offer in hand. Now in the public sector at UC Davis, salaries ranges are going to be oftentimes advertised, so you have a sense of that. Somebody asks what to say about what are your weaknesses. Oh yes, the lovely, what I think of as sort of the negative questions. Tell us about your biggest weakness. Tell us about a failure you had. Tell us about a conflict that you've had with a coworker. And these are questions that you should absolutely, absolutely have thought of a good example of ahead of the interview and talked through how you're going to answer that. Because if you wait till the interview to think of that question, to think of the answer to that question, chances are either your mind's going to go blank, or the only weakness or problem or failure that you can think of is something that you definitely wouldn't want to share in an interview, that you barely are willing to admit to yourself, let alone share with a bunch of other strangers. So when it comes to the weakness question, there's a couple of approaches you can take to this. You can address something that is an obvious weakness. So let's say you're applying for a position in a human resources position in the healthcare arena, but you've never worked in healthcare before. And that's maybe very obvious. So you might say, you know, it's not going to be any surprise to them that you haven't worked in healthcare, but it may be a concern. They may be thinking, well, gosh, this person is great, but do they really understand our industry? Do they really understand healthcare? So you might use that weakness question as your chance to address what they may be thinking, kind of the elephant in the room. So you might say, well, I think for this position, the fact that I haven't specifically worked in healthcare may initially make it a little bit of a steep learning curve. However, And then after that, however, you'll want to talk about any contact that you've had with the healthcare arena, any work that you've been doing to learn about the healthcare arena, and sort of help to address what may be their concerns. So that's one tactic you can take with the weakness question. The other is to talk about something that you used to be not as skilled in, that you've been working to get better at. So you might say, 5 years ago, I was just starting to learn Excel and I really wasn't very good at it. But since then, I've taken classes. I've had 2 jobs that required me to use it a lot. I practice it at home. And now actually I feel like I'm, maybe I'm not an expert yet, but I feel like my skills are advanced. And my next goal is to learn how to make pivot tables. So that's another way to address the weakness question as well. The other phrase that I think is good to use when you're talking about the weakness question is to start out with, I know I have a tendency to. So we all have things that we know that we do that don't necessarily help us out in our jobs. But by saying, I know I have a tendency to do fill in the blank that with that thing that you do that doesn't serve you too well. But here's what I do to make sure that it doesn't impact my work. So you might say, I know I have a tendency to be a little disorganized, and I'm just using this one as an example. I know I have a little bit of a tendency to be disorganized. However, knowing that, here's what I do at work to make sure that I keep everything really organized. I have a calendar, I set reminders, I use Trello, whatever it is that you do. And so consequently, in all of my evaluations, my supervisors have always commented that I'm very well organized, I get my work done on time and with high quality. So that's another way to answer that. So let's see, someone else asks, I was asked this recently in an interview, what skill are you really good at that you knock out of the park, but don't actually enjoy doing? That's a good question. So, there's definitely things probably that that you've done that, or that we all have to do in our work. I'm great at balancing my checkbook. Do I like to do it? No, not at all. But sometimes you can use that question as a way to talk about some of the things that, that you have to do in work that aren't always enjoyable. And you can use a question like that to talk about how you are willing to pitch in, how you're willing to be part of a team, how you're willing to do things that may be outside of your specific assignments for the betterment of the team. So that's a good question. How do you answer, what age groups do you have difficulty dealing with? That is a bit of a challenging question. And hopefully you're not, applying to be a high school teacher and the group that you have difficulty dealing most with is high school students. So, you in any question like that, you can't just say, oh, I like dealing with all age groups and leave it at that. Because, you could certainly say, that you enjoy working with all different age groups. However, what I find sometimes most challenging is this or that. But you have to use that example of how that doesn't impact how you actually work with that group or complete that skill. Somebody asked, when can you start talking about workplace culture, especially working remotely? Yeah, that's a hard one because, normally you would go into a work environment, you would get a sense of what it feels like there, and, you can just kind of pick up on things a little bit. But in this virtual environment, it's hard to do that. So some of the questions that you might ask when they get to that moment of, do you have any questions for us? You could say, I'm really curious about how you would describe the workplace culture. You could ask it really generally like that. Or you could ask more specific questions that might help you determine the workplace culture. So you might say, since everyone's been working at home for the last 3 or 4 months, what are some things that your team has done to connect virtually? Or has your team done anything to connect on a more personal level outside of the work that you're doing? Or you could ask, how are you onboarding new employees that have started over the last few months? So that's a little bit different than just asking straight out, what's your culture like? But sometimes I think those specific questions actually help you understand their culture better, rather than just asking what's your culture like, and then they kind of give you the company line about, you know, their mission statement or something like that. Somebody asks, I think they asked it in 2 different questions. How should you answer a question that asks, what are your strengths? Again, you might answer that a little bit differently depending on the job, because you're going to want to ask questions that are specifically relevant, or you're going to want to answer that in terms of what are the strengths that you have that are most needed for that position that you're applying for. So focus in on that, and not only say my strengths are this, this, and this, but give examples of when you've specific examples that demonstrate that you actually have those skills. All right, so I want to share, I will stay on for a couple minutes after we're done here. There's another question there, a couple of questions that I'll try to get to, but before I do that, I want to share just a couple things with you before we close out here. First of all, as I mentioned, our next webinar is Accomplishment Statements as Success Stories. That's next Wednesday, 11 to noon. Hopefully you'll join us for that. That'll be a good follow-up to this session, because it will give you some thoughts on how to actually put together your answers for those interviews. So again, I just really want to thank you for attending, particularly in light of everything that's going on in our world. And UC Davis and Continuing Education and Professional Education is really been wonderful in sponsoring these very timely webinars. And please check out their website. They have lots of wonderful programs and classes for you. Of course, many are online, even more so than they had in the past, given our current situation. So please visit that. And if you want to share your thoughts about this webinar series or recommend it to a friend, they are recording the series, so you can take a look at that. Please reach out to them on their social media, Facebook, Twitter, and they're using the hashtag FutureProofYourCareer. So if you want to say anything about these webinars, then hopefully good things, then please feel free to share that there. So thank you again for joining. Everyone, take care out there, be safe, be healthy. And as I said, I'll stay on here for a couple minutes and answer another question here that someone had about, well, someone asked about recommending about gaps in employment. And yeah, you know, definitely it's fine to talk about those, you know, being laid off, caring for elderly relatives, caring for children, you know, those things don't hold the stigma that they used to. So, you know, yes, you want to craft your story, and hopefully you weren't just laying on the couch, you know, streaming Netflix and eating bonbons during your, you know, your gap in your employment. Chances are you weren't. So thinking of a way to talk about what you did during that time, and learning and doing things to grow and advance your knowledge are good ways to do that. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope to see you next week at our webinar. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.